The host called him a quiet force in Canadian woodworking, and the camera panned to a man in a faded flannel shirt who looked like he had driven there in a truck older than the studio itself. Lenora Whitfield recognized him immediately. The coffee cup she was holding tilted without her noticing, and the dark liquid ran across the white marble counter and dripped onto the floor, and she did not move to stop it. The man on the screen was Clifford Hays, her ex-husband. He had the same posture he'd always had, slightly forward, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. The interviewer was calling him the founder of one of the most respected custom furniture workshops in Ontario, and Clifford was nodding slowly, the way he nodded when he agreed with something that didn't particularly surprise him. Lenora set the cup down. She looked at the ticker at the bottom of the screen. She read it twice. She had left him with $42 in their joint account and a storage unit full of hand tools she told the mediator were worth nothing. Clifford Hays had grown up in a small town west of Kingston where the winters were long and the conversations were short. His father had been a Finnish carpenter who worked out of a garage attached to the back of the house, and Clifford had spent his childhood in that garage, learning the difference between oak and ash by touch before he could spell either word. He wasn't a talkative man. He never had been. He knew that about himself the way you know the shape of a room you've lived in for decades. Not because you think about it, but because you've never once stubbed your toe in the dark. He married Lenora Whitfield in the spring of his 38th year. She was a corporate communications director with a wardrobe that required its own room and opinions that filled every space she entered. Clifford had admired her energy the way you admire a river. It was impressive and it moved things, and he understood early that he was not the kind of man who would redirect it. They built a life that looked correct from the outside. A house in North Toronto, 2 cars. Dinner parties where Lenora talked and Clifford listened, and their guests left thinking he was either very wise or very boring, and he did not mind either interpretation. He built furniture in the basement on evenings and weekends. A hobby, Lenora called it, though she never used the word warmly. He made a dining table for her sister that made the sister cry when she saw it. He made a rocking chair for a neighbor's elderly mother that the old woman said was the first piece of furniture that had ever felt like it was made specifically for her body. Lenora called these projects Clifford's little woodworking thing at dinner parties. He never corrected her. For 11 years, he gave the marriage what it required. He was steady. He showed up. He believed in the way that quiet men sometimes believe too long, that consistency was a kind of love and that it would eventually be recognized as such. He was wrong about the second part. He found out about the accounts in October, not through a dramatic confrontation, not through a private investigator, but through an envelope that arrived in the mail addressed to him, a statement from a financial institution he didn't recognize, related to a joint investment he had never agreed to. He sat at the kitchen table with the envelope open and read the document 3 times, very carefully, the way he read everything. Then he called his brother in Kingston, and his brother gave him the name of a lawyer. What the lawyer found over the following weeks took longer to process than the legal advice itself. Lenora had been methodically restructuring their shared finances for approximately 2 years. Accounts redirected, assets categorized in ways that removed his name, a property in her mother's name that had been purchased with money drawn from their joint savings, during a period when Clifford had been working a contract in Muskoka and was not checking the statements. The lawyer said it with professional neutrality, but the shape of it was clear. She had known she was leaving long before she told him. The divorce was filed in February. By March, the house was on the market. By June, the legal settlement had been reached. A settlement that, his lawyer explained, was the best that could be achieved given the documentation trail Lenora's team had constructed. Clifford walked out of the mediator's office on a Tuesday afternoon with the clothes in his 2 suitcases, his truck, his hand tools, his father's workbench, and a number that he did not tell anyone because there was no one he wanted to worry. The number was $460. He drove west out of the city without a specific plan, which was unusual for him. He had always been a man who thought before he moved. But there was a quality to that afternoon, the flat gray sky over the 401, the trucks moving past him on both sides, that made planning feel beside the point. He drove until he was hungry, which turned out to be Belleville, and he stopped at a diner and had soup and coffee, and looked out the window at the parking lot for a long time. Then he called his brother. His brother, whose name was Dennis, lived on a property outside Kingston with a barn he didn't use. He offered it without hesitation and without ceremony, which was exactly what Clifford needed. "Come," Dennis said. "There's a space heater in there somewhere. I'll find it." Clifford moved into the barn in early July. It had a concrete floor, good light from the south-facing windows, and a smell of old hay that faded after the first week. He set up his father's workbench along the east wall and arranged his tools the way his father had taught him, each one in its place, each one within reach without looking. He slept on a cot in the corner, behind a curtain Dennis's wife had hung for privacy. He had $460. He spent $80 of it on lumber. Not premium stock, but the kind of material that rewarded careful hands. He made a small side table first, because a small side table required less material and less time, and would tell him quickly whether his hands still knew what they were doing after months of not working them. His hands knew. The table came together over 2 evenings with the quiet confidence of muscle memory, and when he ran his palm across the finished surface, he felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. He photographed it against the barn wall in the morning light and posted it on a marketplace platform he'd never used before. Setting the price at what he calculated was fair without being aggressive. It sold in 3 hours to a woman in Napanee who said she'd been looking for something exactly like it. He used the money to buy more lumber. There was a period that summer and early fall that Clifford would later describe to his brother as the working. Not building a business, not executing a plan, just working, the way a man works when the work is the only thing that makes sense. He was up before 6 every morning. He learned the light in the barn, when it was good for detail work, when it was flat. He learned which of the local suppliers would give him a better price if he came in person, and which ones rewarded loyalty with quality. He kept a notebook on the workbench, the same kind his father had used, a green hardcover with unlined pages, and in it he wrote measurements and notes about materials and occasionally, in the margins, things he'd noticed, the way a particular joint held, the way certain grain patterns moved in different lights. He didn't think about Lenora much. This surprised him, but he accepted it. He had loved her in the way he did things, steadily, without performance, and the love had outlasted its usefulness, and now the barn was quiet and the work was in front of him, and that was enough. By September, he had a waiting list. He hadn't planned the waiting list. It had assembled itself from word of mouth in the way that genuinely good things sometimes do, without advertising, without effort beyond the work itself. A man in Gananoque had bought one of his coffee tables and told his colleague, who was renovating a house in Prince Edward County. A woman in Kingston had commissioned a built-in bookshelf and posted photographs on a community design group that had more followers than Clifford would have guessed. His phone, an older model he hadn't updated, started receiving messages from numbers he didn't recognize. He answered every one of them, usually in the evenings, briefly and directly, the way he communicated. By October, he had moved out of the corner with the cot and into a rented room in a farmhouse 2 kilometers down the road. By November, he had paid Dennis back for the first month of barn use, and Dennis had refused the payment twice before accepting it on the 3rd offer. By December, Clifford Hays Woodworking had a name, not because he'd decided to formalize anything, but because the woman in Prince Edward County had listed him that way in her design group post, and it had stuck. He hadn't spoken to Lenora since the day the settlement was signed. She had sent 2 text messages in the months following, one in August, casual in tone, asking how he was settling in, as though they were old acquaintances checking in. One in November that said she was thinking about him and that she hoped things were okay. He had read both messages, set the phone down on the workbench, and returned to what he was doing. He did not reply. There was nothing dishonest in the silence. He simply had nothing to say that would be useful to either of them. He did not think of it as revenge. He did not think of it as building towards something that would prove her wrong. He thought of it as getting up in the morning and doing the work. The outcome was a consequence of the work, not the goal of it. This was a distinction that mattered to him, even if he never said it aloud. The article came out in March, 15 months after he had arrived in the barn. A writer for a regional lifestyle publication had heard about him from an architect in Kingston who had hired Clifford to build a custom reception desk for her firm, a piece that had prompted 3 separate clients to ask her where it came from. The writer had contacted Clifford through the marketplace profile, and Clifford had agreed to speak with her in the same way he agreed to most things, without great enthusiasm, but without refusal. The article was longer than he'd expected. The writer had come to the barn. He had moved his operation into a proper workshop space by then, a rented building on the outskirts of Napanee with 12-foot ceilings and a loading door, and had spent an afternoon watching him work. She wrote about the quality of the pieces. She wrote about the waiting list, which by then was 8 months long. She wrote about the green notebook on the bench. She wrote about a particular detail she'd noticed: the way Clifford's hands moved across a finished surface before he called something done, like a final question he was asking the wood. The article was picked up by a larger publication in Ottawa. From there, a regional morning program in Toronto reached out about a segment on Ontario craftspeople building independent businesses outside the city. Clifford said he'd come in if they could do it on a Thursday. He had a delivery. On Wednesday, he didn't want to rearrange. They said Thursday was fine. Lenora Whitfield saw the segment by accident. She had been in her home office reviewing a presentation deck when her assistant texted her a link with no explanation. Just a question mark. She clicked it. She recognized the flannel shirt before she recognized his face. Her hand with the phone in it lowered slowly to the desk. The host was describing Clifford Hays as one of the most significant independent craftspeople working in Ontario today. He was showing a piece he'd brought, a writing desk in white oak with hand-cut dovetail joints that the host ran her fingers along without speaking for a moment before continuing. Clifford was explaining, in his quiet way, what made the joint work, what you had to understand about the material before you could cut it correctly. He used no jargon. He spoke the way he always had, like someone who had thought about something long enough that he no longer needed many words to say it. Lenora set the phone down. She picked it up again. She watched the rest of the segment. There was a moment near the end where the host asked him what the last year and a half had taught him. Clifford was quiet for a few seconds, not the silence of someone who didn't know the answer, but the silence of someone choosing which true thing to say. "That the work knows," he said finally. "If you're honest with it, it tells you what it is. You just have to be willing to listen." The host nodded as though this was profound. Clifford looked like a man who had simply answered the question. Lenora watched the segment a second time. Then she put her phone face down on the desk and sat in her office chair for a long time, not reviewing the presentation deck. She thought about the storage unit full of hand tools she had told the mediator were worth nothing. She thought about 11 years of dinner parties where she had called it Clifford's little woodworking thing. She thought about the expression he'd had on his face, not on the television, but in the mediator's office on the day the settlement was signed. She had categorized the expression at the time as resignation. Looking back now, sitting in her office, she wasn't sure. She had not, she understood, been paying close enough attention to know the difference between a man who was resigned and a man who was simply not afraid. She did not contact him. There was nothing honest she could have said. That spring, Clifford moved the workshop into a larger space, a converted granary outside Kingston that his brother had helped him negotiate, owned by a retired couple who were glad to see the building used. He hired 2 assistants, a young man named Glenn, who had studied woodworking at a college in New Brunswick, and a woman in her 50s named Vera, who had spent 20 years doing finish carpentry on commercial projects and was tired of the pace. They were good workers. Clifford told them what he needed and trusted them to do it, which both of them later said was the most refreshing quality in a boss they had encountered. The waiting list reached 14 months. He was commissioned by a small hotel in Prince Edward County to furnish 4 of its rooms, beds, side tables, armoires, writing desks, each piece built to fit the specific proportions of the room it was going into. The hotel owner, a woman who had read the Ottawa article twice, said she wanted the furniture to feel like it had always been there, like it had grown out of the building itself. Clifford said he understood. He visited the rooms before he built a single piece. He kept the green notebook on the bench in the converted granary, same as it had always been on the bench in the barn. Glenn asked him once what was in it. "Measurements," Clifford said, "and things I've noticed." Glenn nodded. He didn't ask a follow-up. Dennis's wife, whose name was Maureen, had a niece in Peterborough named Alicia, who worked in marketing and had offered on several occasions to help Clifford build a proper online presence. He had thanked her each time and done nothing. He did not have a website. His marketplace profile still had the same photograph of the first side table he'd made in the barn, the one he'd taken against the barn wall in the morning light. He had not changed it because no one had told him it was a problem and he had not thought to wonder. Alicia drove to Kingston one Saturday in April with her laptop and a patience that impressed even her own mother. She built him a simple website, nothing complicated, just photographs of the work and a contact form, and showed him how to add to it. He thanked her and made her lunch. She said the lunch alone was worth the drive, which was the kind of thing people said to Clifford more often than he noticed. The website received 43 inquiries in its first week. He answered all of them in the evenings, briefly and directly, from the farmhouse where he still rented the same room. He had been offered a larger place twice and had declined both times. The room was sufficient. He slept well in it. He was not the kind of man who required more space than he used. He went back to Toronto once that summer for a delivery to a client in the East End, a full bedroom set that had taken him 4 months to build. In cherry, the wood warm and close-grained and almost red in certain lights. He drove the truck himself, with Glenn riding along for the unloading. He had not been back since he'd left in February 2 years earlier. The city felt the same and also completely different, which he understood was the city not having changed and himself having changed, though not in any way he would have described as dramatic. He was the same man. He just occupied himself differently. They delivered the furniture and the client. An older man named Bernard, who had retired from teaching and recently lost his wife, walked through the bedroom slowly after everything was in place, touching the headboard, opening and closing the drawer of the nightstand. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "My wife would have loved this," he said finally. Clifford said he was glad. He meant it without complication. On the drive back out of the city, they passed within 3 blocks of the house on the north side, where he and Lenora had lived for 9 years. He noticed it without feeling the need to comment on it to Glenn. The house was behind them, and then further behind them, and then the highway was in front of him, and the sky was the flat, wide sky he had got used to, and he put the window down an inch and drove. The segment aired nationally 6 months later. A documentary producer had seen the regional morning program and had reached out about a longer feature. A half-hour piece about craftspeople working outside major centers, people who had built something genuine in places that didn't require them to explain themselves constantly. Clifford had agreed after asking 2 questions. How long would filming take, and would they be in the workshop while he was working? The producer said 4 days of filming, and yes, they would be in the workshop. Clifford said that was fine. The documentary aired on a Tuesday night in November. Clifford watched it at Dennis and Maureen's house, sitting on their couch with a cup of tea, and he thought it was reasonably accurate. He said so when Dennis asked. Dennis said that was high praise coming from Clifford, and Clifford allowed that it probably was. The green notebook appeared in the documentary. The producer had asked if she could film it, and Clifford had said she could look at it if she kept the camera on the cover. She had respected that. In the final edit, the notebook appeared twice, once on the bench at the start of the segment, and once at the end with a brief close-up of the cover and the handwriting just visible on one open page at the edge of the frame. The producer had asked him why the notebook mattered to him, and Clifford had said it was where he put what he knew, so he didn't have to carry it in his head all the time. The producer had used the quote near the end of the segment. It was, along with the earlier line about the work knowing, the thing people repeated to each other after watching. Lenora watched the documentary at home, alone. She had not planned to watch it. She had seen a mention of it in a design newsletter she subscribed to. Clifford Hays, Ontario woodworker, Tuesday, 9 p.m., and had closed the newsletter and opened it again twice before Tuesday. She told herself she was curious in the way you are curious about anything adjacent to your past. She turned it on at 9 and watched it through to the end. He looked, she thought, like a man who had arranged himself correctly. Not happy in a performed way, not successful in a way that required an audience, but settled, the way a piece of furniture is settled when every joint is properly made, and the wood has adjusted to its environment, and there is nothing left to shift. She thought about a version of her life in which she had understood 11 years ago that, Clifford's little woodworking thing was the most serious thing about him. She turned the television off. She did not contact him. There was, as there had been before, nothing honest she could have said. She had made calculations, and the calculations had been wrong, and the error was not correctable by conversation. Some things you live with in that way, not as punishment, but as accounting. In the spring following the documentary, Clifford Hays Woodworking received a commission from a small museum in Prince Edward County that was building a permanent installation space. They wanted display cases, 12 of them, each one built to house a specific object from the collection, each case made to the exact dimensions and environmental requirements of the piece it would hold. The project would take 8 months. The budget was the largest he had ever worked with. Clifford sat with the proposal at the workbench for one evening, and then called the museum's director in the morning and said yes. He hired a third assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had just graduated from a fine arts program and was looking for work that required her to use her hands. She was precise and she was fast, and she did not talk unnecessarily, which Clifford appreciated without saying so. The 4 of them worked through the summer in the granary, with the loading door open and the light coming in off the fields, and Clifford kept the notebook on the bench, and Glenn kept asking the right questions, and Vera kept doing things correctly the first time, and Priya kept surprising him with what her hands knew. He thought, sometimes, about his father's garage in the town west of Kingston, the smell of it. The patience his father had shown him, not the patience of a teacher explaining, but the patience of a man working beside another person and trusting them to see what needed to be seen. He thought that this was, of all the things his father had given him, the most useful, not the skill itself, the patience underneath the skill. He wrote this in the margin of the notebook one afternoon when the others were at lunch. The installation opened in October to an audience of people who knew about furniture and people who didn't, and what Clifford noticed was that both groups stopped at the cases in the same way, slowing down, leaning slightly in, reaching a hand toward the glass before remembering they weren't supposed to touch. He stood at the side of the room and watched this happen and felt, in the quiet way he felt things, that this was correct, that this was what the work was for. Dennis and Maureen came. Glenn brought his girlfriend, Vera brought her daughter. Priya came with a college friend who kept pulling out her phone to photograph the cases, and Priya kept gently redirecting her to just look. The museum director gave a short speech. She mentioned Clifford by name, and he nodded once from the side of the room. Afterward, a journalist who had been invited to cover the opening asked him what it felt like to see the installation completed. Clifford considered this. "It feels like the work is in its right place," he said. "That's what you're working toward, putting the thing where it belongs." The journalist wrote the quote down. He looked up to ask a follow-up question, and Clifford was already talking to Dennis, his hands around a glass of water, his voice low, his posture the same one it had always been. Slightly forward, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Outside in the parking lot, his truck sat where he had left it. Same truck as always. Dent above the rear wheel well on the driver's side that he had never bothered to fix. A crack in the passenger side mirror that gave you 2 slightly different angles on what was behind you, which had always struck him as more information rather than less. He drove home through the county in the dark, the fields flat on either side, and the sky enormous above them, and he thought about the next project, a commission from a family in Westport who wanted a harvest table large enough for 12 people. In Elm, the wood difficult and beautiful and worth the effort, and by the time he reached the farmhouse, the plan for it was already taking shape, measured and clear, the way things were when he let them come at their own pace. He parked the truck. He went inside. He put the kettle on. The notebook was on the table where he'd left it, open to the page between the measurements for the museum cases and a small sketch he'd made of the elm table's proportions. The handwriting was his father's kind of handwriting, economical, no extra strokes, each letter carrying exactly its own weight. He closed it and carried his tea to the window and looked out at the dark.